I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, New York Times columnist Dan Barry joins us to discuss his new compendium of writings from legendary New Yorker and fellow columnist and my former colleague, Jimmy Breslin. But first, has the influx of migrants contributed to a crime wave in New York? Mayor Adams takes a lot of flack, but what's the actual record on crime in the first half of his term? New York Times reporter Maria Cramer covers crime and the city. She joins us now. Maria, welcome and thank you for joining us. The police commissioner said not that long ago that a migrant crime wave is washing over the city. How does he know that?
Well, that's a good question. We asked the police department to have him clarify those remarks and provide statistics that would show whether or not there was indeed a crime wave. And in response to that question, we were referred to a news conference where he made that statement. But no numbers were provided aside from a couple of more anecdotal figures that were given about robberies that were committed on mopeds. We didn't get, any data that would indicate a crime wave. So we decided to look at the numbers ourselves to see if there indeed was one.
And has there been one?
No, the data does not indicate a crime wave. It shows that since we have in the city been seeing, and since April 2022, this large influx of immigrants coming in, that the numbers have stayed relatively flat, if not gone down. There have been fluctuations, of course, but nothing that would indicate a crime wave, even in those categories where immigrants have been committing more of the crimes, such as robberies or grand larcenies. We haven't been seeing what you would call a wave of crime.
Of course, it's a little like stop and frisk. It's hard to disprove a negative. We don't know how much more crime would have gone down if there had not been an influx of migrants. Is that right?
That's absolutely true. And you also have, 170,000 plus people coming into the city, in less than a 2-year period. That is a huge number of people to be coming in. And of course, it's going to affect data points in many fields. And so, of course, in crime, that would be the one that people will be most cognizant of. But in order to really say that you have a crime wave, you have to have large amounts of data showing something like this. And we just don't have that.
You talk about people committing robberies on mopeds. Where do they get the money to buy the mopeds?
That's an excellent question. I mean, mopeds have been a source of revenue for many of the migrants. I mean, there have been when you think about it, this is one of the only ways that some of them can make money, right? They use mopeds in order to do deliveries, and so it's become a source of income for them. And migrants themselves have been the victims of mopeds being stolen. So the moped has become a really important source of economic revenue for migrants because they need, they don't have, it's very difficult for them to get jobs, and the mopeds allow them to call a living in some way while they're waiting for papers.
Isn't it even harder to get statistics or know whether the statistics are right or not because cops are not allowed to ask a suspect what his or her immigrant status is?
Well, that's a big part of this question, right? How do you know if there's a migrant crime wave when you can't even ask the people that you are apprehending if they're here if they're from another country, if they're here illegally? You cannot ask that question in New York. And so therefore, finding out who's committing crimes it's a very difficult number to pin down. That's a big part of the equation, and why many people's eyebrows went up when the commissioner made that statement.
If you look back historically at immigrants over the past 200 years, Irish, Italians, Jews have been accused of accounting for a disproportionate amount of crime in the city as they became early immigrants. I'm going out on a limb here, but it would seem like on the basis of what you're saying, what you've reported in the Times, the newer migrants, at least in the past year or so, have been responsible much less for any increase in crime. Does that seem right?
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't want to we don't want to state what's going on. Of course, there have been some very scary crimes that have taken place, and they have been at the hands of migrants, right? We had a shooting in Times Square where a tourist was struck by a 15-year-old boy who was then shooting at the police, and we have had we had the incident in Times Square where you saw men assaulting police officers. Of course, there's some questions about how that incident began. Videos showed that police officers instigated the encounter with those men and got pretty aggressive with them. But at the same time, and there's been some real brutality that's been showcased. We've been seeing it in videos, and so therefore, you see this thing elevated, on screen and images like that, and people are going to react quite, they're going to react quite forcefully towards that. At the same time, yes, that the data has consistently shown that when new migrants come into the country, the crime figures don't reflect a rise. It's often the opposite.
Maria, the mayor has been through more than half of his term, his first term at least. Has he got a handle on crime? He's a former cop. He promised that he would. Where do we stand now compared to some of his predecessors?
Well, that's a question that I think we're still trying to resolve ourselves, because yes, you are seeing a decrease in crime, but it's been a very, very kind of small and measured decrease in crime. Homicides are way down, shootings are down as well. But you have other crime categories that have been really persistent. For example, felony assaults. These are numbers that continue to either stay steady or sometimes even rise. And it's difficult to say if we have a handle on crime, especially when you see what's going on in the transit system. Crime there has definitely been stubborn. So I think the jury is still out on exactly how crime is going down under this administration. But one thing that needs to be pointed out is that crime is far lower in 2024 than it was in 2000, than it was in 2010. There remains a steady decline in crime. That is the trend, and that has been the trend nationwide. That's an important context to put these crime numbers into, because I think that the reaction has been that in the last 2 years we've had this enormous crime wave and crime is out of control. But when you look at the overall data over a long period of time, you'll see that crime remains much lower than it was the last 10 to 20 years.
A quick last question. Is the police department being run by the police commissioner or by City Hall?
Well, that is a debate that continues as well. As you said before, the mayor is a former police captain. He's heavily involved in the police department. He has said that is an agency that he feels very close to, very driven to know what's happening in. And he also says that about many of the other agencies that he runs that fall under his administration. He prides himself on being somebody who knows the inner workings of all these departments, because he himself was a longtime city employee, unlike other mayors. So that is something that he takes a lot of pride in, but it does raise the question and the criticism of whether he's too hands-on.
Maria Cramer, The New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, the columnist Dan Barry on the late Jimmy Breslin. Picture the quintessential newspaper reporter and you'll conjure up Dan Barry or Jimmy Breslin. A master storyteller and shoe leather news hound, he enthralled his readers writing about politics, social issues, the lives of ordinary citizens and their working class neighborhoods. I was friends with Jimmy, and so was my Times colleague Dan Barry. He just edited a collection of Jimmy's essential writings for the Library of America. Dan, you point out that Jimmy, who died at 88 in 2017, worked for 5 decades at the Herald Tribune, the Long Island Press, the New York Post, Daily News, Journal American, and Newsday. They are either no longer in existence or shadows of themselves. What does that say about journalism in New York City?
that it's finding different avenues to provide information and elucidation. I think because, you know, even the New York Times is driven mostly by digital. Most people consume the New York Times through their mobile app, their iPhone. And so I think it's just changing how information is being shared. On the other hand, you could argue that there are fewer voices, fewer large voices out there. It's not like you go to the newsstand anymore and see 6, 7 different newspapers there and you pick 3 or 4 and you have different voices. That's not happening as much.
Could a voice like Jimmy's, which was a very powerful voice, to read, to have impact on policy, to have impact on people's feelings, could a voice like that thrive in this environment? Or did you have to read it, hold it in your hand? Did you have to feel that tactile? Or digitally, does it just sort of vanish into the ozone?
That's a pretty existential question.
Yes,
Sam.
it is.
And
You're just the guy to ask.
I think that when you think of Breslin, you do think of like reading the Daily News or New York Newsday while you're sitting on the 2 train or something like that. And I wonder if voices are muted a little bit because they're being experienced through the digital world. But I think Breslin stood alone. And it'd be interesting, of course. I would love to hear what he would say about the Trump presidency and now the Trump pursuit of a second term. Breslin really held Trump in contempt back in the day and called his bluff way before anyone else.
Right, he saw it early on.
He did.
There are 67 columns in this book, 6 magazine pieces, 2 books, short books. In the book, Jimmy Breslin, Essential Writings. How'd you pick them out? How'd you choose them?
I really just sat in my office and read pretty much all of them. And, you know, he was writing sometimes 4 and 5 times a week. Mm-hmm. And I remember Frank Klein's telling me once, if you're hitting 400, you're doing very well. In other words, 2 out of 5 is good. You know, Breslin, I think, was hitting way higher than that, but not all of them were outstanding. Mm-hmm. Some of them were meeting a deadline and, you know, feeding the dragon. And so, you know, 50 years, 60 years of writing, there's a lot to read and consume. And then, to my mind, columns rose to the top. You know, if he's visiting Joey Gallo's grandmother in her apartment in President Street in 1963, that rises to a different level. And you don't see that kind of journalism anymore, by the way. But when he would do that, he was at his best.
Why don't you see that kind of journalism anymore? I mean, people are smart, people are good writers, people have passion, people have more outlets now, arguably, than they ever did before. Why don't you see that kind of journalism?
I don't know. I would look at it through the prism of New York City, because we would have many journalistic rogues wandering the city and walking up and down tenement stairs looking for stories, and you don't see that as much anymore. I don't know. I think maybe perhaps we're too busy, or there's too much information coming from other avenues. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't mind doing that again. So would you.
So would I. Jimmy said it was all about a 4-letter word, W-O-R-K, and he did. And some people said, well, didn't he make this stuff up? Was it true or was it truth? But he rode all over the city, not driving himself, and walked up those tenement stairs and went all over the place and talked to these real people. And do people do that anymore?
I do.
I talk to dead people now, writing obituaries.
Well, you know, the way Breslin would work, by the way, is, as you know, he would begin working the phones at 6 o'clock in the morning, calling up judges and politicians.
Tell me about it.
Other reporters, yourself. And he would find something, he would draw a bead on something, and then, as his wife Ronnie Eldridge told me, he then would have to go and see it. In other words, now I think people are quite comfortable in opining from their offices, but Breslin felt the need to bear witness, and I think that made his stuff rise to a different level. It was superior.
And it rose to a different level, and he found people on the scene that no one else would have found or no one else would have thought to look for. The John Lennon murder, the Kennedy funeral. Tell us about some of those things.
Sure. You know, let's just take the John Lennon murder, for example. The call came into his home at around 11:20 at night, and he was in bed. He got into some clothes, raced to the scene, raced to the hospital, raced to the precinct, and then went back to the Daily News and wrote a very powerful piece about the experience of being in charge of the body of a beetle, these two patrolmen, and what that felt like. And he filed it to make the 1:30 deadline in the Daily News, which is astounding. And then, of course, he made a mistake. He says Williams Avenue instead of Willis Avenue, but then he blames someone else in classic Breslin form. He wouldn't own that.
Right, someone who was taking dictation.
That's right. And two things. First, people remember the gravedigger story. He writes the story about Mr. Pollard, who dug the grave for John F. Kennedy at Arlington. But before that, he had done this brilliant story about the doctor who received Kennedy's body and spent several panicked minutes trying to massage the president's heart, even though the president was dead, while the president's wife was standing there watching. And it is a riveting story. So he does the surgeon story, he does the gravedigger story, and then this was in late November of '63. It's Thanksgiving time. He's back in New York, and what does he do on Thanksgiving morning? He goes to the automat, and he writes. Really, what he's writing about is a city in mourning, or a country in mourning. But he never says that. He just describes these lonely hearts sitting in an automat on Thanksgiving Day.
Was that the new journalism, or was it really the old journalism?
He always scoffed at the new journalism label that Tom Wolfe and others had applied to what he was doing. He would say, first of all, it was really sports writing, and then he would say...
Which is how he started.
That's right. Then he would say, and the whole idea of going to the loser's locker room rather than the winner's locker room, go to the graveyard rather than to the pageantry of the funeral service. Yeah. So.
He was very prescient about people. As you say, Donald Trump, he called his number very early on. Rudy Giuliani, I remember he said he was a man in search of a balcony, one of the great phrases of all time. What was it instinctively? He was a kid from Queens. Why was he so instinctively aware of what people were all about?
I don't know. He said that what motivated him and what motivated any good columnist was rage. And I think that he felt strongly the challenges of the disenfranchised, and he distrusted the powerful. And his wife told me that when he would go out and see, say, a murder scene or go into a tenement in a poor neighborhood and really feel and truly empathize with what he was witnessing, he would go back, write the column, and then he would take to his bed. He would really feel what was being experienced by others. And I think that is one of the reasons we're talking about him today.
And he would feel that rage and anger that nothing was being done about it.
Right.
Although one of the things, as we said earlier, is his columns did have impact. When he talked about something, people listened, people in City Hall, people in government listened, and I'm not sure that happens anymore. I remember he did a lot of columns on the Concorde, the SST, landing at Kennedy Airport, and in a stroke of something or other, he said he was going to Europe, and I booked him on the Concorde coming home, and I wanted to make sure he got home in time to write a column for the first edition. And I called, I guess it was British Airlines, and said, "How's the plane doing?" And the guy said, "Well, I've got good news and bad news for you. The plane has landed, but it's landed in Nova Scotia, not at Kennedy Airport, because it had a mishap. This is the first time the Concorde didn't land where it was supposed to land." And I said, "My God, how could you ask for anything more? And Jimmy Breslin was on it. And there was a picture of him that came over the wire in black and white, but you could see Jimmy's face was green in that photograph because he was obviously terrified of being in this sardine can of a plane. But I don't think he ever quite forgave me for that.
Yeah. Also, we haven't really talked about his use of humor. And I think his use of humor and signaling to the reader that, we're all just fools on this earth, really resonated with, the working class guy in Ridgewood or the woman who's cleaning offices in Lower Manhattan. Like, he was able to meet people where they were, and he did it with rage, but he also did it with humor and insight.
Did he lose credibility because of some of the characters he made up, who in fact were not really made up? I mean, Klein the lawyer, Inuccio, Marvin the Torch, they were actually real figures.
Yeah, the only one, right, he had several, Fat Thomas, these were real people. The only one that is a little, we don't know who this person is Inuccio. Right?
I thought he was Fat Tony Salerno.
Oh, I don't know. All right, there you go. That would have been the mob boss. Who he basically ridiculed.
Right, had the big dog. I forget what kind of dog it was.
I think
Wolfhound.
That's right, the wolfhound. Right. Well, on the other hand, Joey Gallo did in fact have a lion on a leash. But I think that the way he wrote those stories about Fat Thomas and Klein the lawyer, the readers were in on the joke. Do you know what I mean? He was being a little hyperbolic here and there. It's a real person, but he's having a laugh, and everyone else is having a laugh with him. But then, when he is witnessing the assassination of Robert Kennedy, or he's there when Malcolm X gets shot, he was a witness to history in so many ways. They're unimpeachable accounts.
Ed Kozner in the Wall Street Journal, reviewing the book that you edited, said the magnificent journalism Breslin produced in his long career amounts to a pocket history of our times, and it certainly did. You had to write his obituary for the New York Times. How do you write an obituary of someone you know well and know about his work?
I think it's what we journalists do all the time. We set aside our emotions, whether you're writing about 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina or something along those lines. You sit at the laptop and you set aside your emotions and you focus on what's in front of you. And it was this larger than life personality who had a profound impact on me as a young man and as a journalist and the country. And then after you're done, and the editor says this works mostly, it's not Breslin, but it works, then you go and you have a cry or a beer.
There were a lot of columnists around, Pete Hamill, Jim Dwyer, Mike McAlery, others at the time. What made Breslin so special?
I think he was really a poet at heart. He had this kind of personality that he had created of being a hard-drinking boor, but in fact he was
really a softie.
He was a very, very soft heart and would take care of people who were sick, visiting them in the hospital and everything. So so there's that, but also his use of language. If you go back, as I did, and read the stuff, he's very specific in his language, hard-hitting, wasting no words, and oftentimes simple. There's no need for elaboration. There's no need for adjectives. He is like hitting you one after another with images that are hard and constructed well, and you come away and you feel it.
Beautiful. Dan Barry, the book is Jimmy Breslin, Essential Writings from the Library of America. Thank you for joining us. Coming up next, my thoughts on how New Yorkers communicate. If out-of-towners don't always understand New Yorkers, it's not just because we talk fast. More languages are spoken here than any place else on the globe. This is the most linguistically diverse city in the world. By one count, some 800 languages are spoken in the city. In the public schools, you might hear as many as 180. At last count, Queens residents listed some 140 languages that they spoke regularly at home. What's even more fascinating, as I reported in the Times a few years ago, is that some foreign languages are now spoken more widely in New York City than they are in the countries where they originated. That's true for a number of reasons. Members of minority groups confronted with discrimination, hunger, genocide often flee as refugees together. Driven out, they depopulate their ethnic enclaves back home. Typically, immigrants from a region or town gravitate to the same neighborhoods here. The first generation finds English too difficult. The second and third generations sometimes looks to preserve what's left of their heritage, which is why the chances of overhearing a conversation in Vlaški are greater in Queens than in the remote mountain villages of Croatia, where the language originated, or Garifuna, which originated with descendants of African slaves shipwrecked in the Caribbean. Today, it's almost as common in the Bronx and Brooklyn as in Honduras and Belize. The search for those languages and the campaign to keep them alive is described in a new book by Ross Perlin. It's called Language City: The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York. It's reviewed by Deirdre Mask in this week's New York Times Book Review. She describes Language City as a deft refutation of the parable of the Tower of Babel. You remember, God disapproved when the people of Babel were building a tower that would reach to heaven. He confused their language so they would not understand each other. Then he scattered them over the earth. Far from scattering, the Times reviewer wrote, people have instead converged on the city, bringing their words with them, and New York's towers have never risen higher. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.